Hi, everyone. Welcome to From Wake Up Calls to What's Next, Benchmarking that Transforms. I'm Charles Gustine, Director of Customer and Market Insight at Cantata, and I'm really excited to be back on the Converge stage today, this time alongside Connor Budden, Global Director at Service Performance Insight, to talk about the power of benchmarking. I'm going to introduce Connor and SPI a little more in just a moment as I ask Connor to help break down what the professional services maturity model is. And then we're going to get into various topics, right? What is the impact of leadership? SPI has these five pillars, but maybe leadership is the most impactful of them all. How do benchmarking wake up calls drive that better leadership that we're all looking for? And then we're actually going to be unveiling a major announcement for the first time. This has been a week of announcements and previews and unveilings, but this is a really big one as we'll talk about what SPI Inside is and what it means for the expertise engine and what's next. So, really quickly before I hand off to Connor, we are going to be talking about some product futures here. So safe harbor statement, what's represented here may not ultimately be exactly what happens. And with that, Connor, I'm going to hand over to you to talk a bit about where SPI has been, where it's going, and what it's doing.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. So I think from my side then, let's start with a question. How do you really know if your services organization is world class or if it's just running on heroic effort? Are you the Barcelona football or soccer team, or have you just happened to hire Cristiano Ronaldo? We've all seen it where you've got consultants duct taping process together, Slack is blowing up, late nights, all of that stuff works, but it's fragile. Jumping on to the next slide for me, Charles. So us at SPI Research, we've been benchmarking professional services firms for 20 years. We've had more than 8,000 firms take part in that benchmark. And this year we've just launched our 19th benchmark. And what I'm going to share today comes from that data. This is about what separates the top 5% of performers that we see from the rest. So let's dig in. So we have five pillars, as Charles mentioned. We've got leadership, which is about setting vision and direction. We've got client relationships, building the backlog, creating demand, sales. Talent, the central pillar, because without the right people, nothing else works. And if you've ever had to staff a project with the one consultant who just learned how to use the tool they're about to implement, you know what I'm talking about. Service execution, delivering what it is that you've sold. For us in the professional services industry, this is where our profit is made. Finance and operations, this is about tracking KPIs, margins, receivables, and keeping the business on target. So we like to think of these five pillars as kind of gears in a machine. If one slips, the whole system sort of starts to suffer a little bit. You can have strong sales, but if you don't have strong delivery, it's a bit of a disaster. You can have great delivery, but if you don't have the talent, well, to be honest, it's kind of impossible anyway. So on the right, you'll see we've got a bit of a gauge here. And this is a bit of a reminder that at SPI, we view maturity as always relative. So you're not just moving through a framework that we've set, it's you versus the market and where the market is today. So if I give a quick analogy just to explain that, imagine you're playing golf. You shoot 10 under par and you win the tournament. Fantastic, that's great. You come back a year later, you shoot 10 under par and you're 40th. It's not that you've gotten worse, it's the rest of the field has gotten better. And so that's one of the things that we're super conscious about. So if you look here, we've got level one. This is where most firms tend to start. We call this heroic. People are pushing hard, they get things done, it's brute force, it's not necessarily scalable. And then on the other side of this gauge, we've got the optimized side, which is our green bit. This is level 5, real-time governance, processes humming along, that real business engine is just working. But the problem with this side over here is that, firstly, only 5% of firms ever get there. But also, that top tier is where we see the extraordinary EBITDA and margin. And it's also worth knowing that we don't see a lot of firms that stay there the entire time. We see firms jump backwards and forwards between level 4 and level 5. Let's talk a little bit about why maturity matters. So here, well, I presented this slide a few times, and executives always do the same thing. They look straight at the bottom part of this, the EBITDA. And to be honest, they're right too. And so here, if you look at the EBITDA difference between a level 1 firm and a level 2 firm, it's almost double. You look at the difference between a level 4 firm and a level 5 firm, the jump is massive. This happens to be the data from our latest benchmark, 2025. However, this is consistent throughout all 20 years that we've done benchmarking. So even though last year was a poor year for revenue growth in PS, it was one of the lowest we'd ever seen on record, we still saw these jumps play out between the levels 1s, 2, and 3s in our maturity model that we've got. Let's dive into the cogs and how things are a little bit more interconnected. So here we start talking about cross-functional maturity. So it's not just good to be really, really well versed in one pillar and score high in one pillar. You have to look at things across the board. So if we look here, we've got leadership as represented by the purple cogs. We've got client relationships or sales represented by the orange cogs, talent in blue, service execution in red, and ops and finance in that kind of green. And here, if you've got really great leadership, you can have the best vision in the world. But as I said earlier, if you don't have the capability to deliver, it's a little bit like announcing you're going to run a marathon and then realizing that you've only trained by walking to the fridge, right? It just doesn't work. And so we use this to work out, okay, where are your gears aligned and where do they grind? So where do they need to change a bit? So let's dig a bit deeper with our scorecards. So we use scorecards and we take a look at our 165 metrics and we use them to position your performance in relation to everyone else. And here, what we're really doing is we're looking for where are you red? So where are you level 1 compared to the rest of the market? We call this getting the red out. We do this because the easiest way to make those jumps between level 1, 2, or 2 to 3, etc., and to increase your chances of that EBITDA jump is to get the red out and start improving in those areas. So we kind of treat this scorecard a little bit like, dashboard warning lights. If you ignore them for too long, or if you don't know that they're there, chances are you're going to start to have some problems with your engine.
Question for you, Connor. How are these scorecard engagements that you do different from what people might get from reading the kind of annual benchmark report, which obviously is very comprehensive, but in what ways does this go a level deeper than that?
Yeah, so the data that we provide here is specific to your company and your industry, whereas the benchmark report just shows you all of the average data that we have across everything. And this also specifically rates your company against everyone else as well. So you could sit there and try and do that against the benchmark report, but it won't be specific to your industry and specific to the kind of companies that are out there. I mean, if you're an IT organization and you're being compared against architecture, that's not a lot of help, right? We want to compare like for like.
Yeah, you'll never get granular enough with the report because it can show the average for IT services and it can show the average for your size, but you can never kind of aggregate, well, what's the average for my industry, my size, my geography? Whereas when you're doing these scorecard engagements, you're really refining down across, I don't know what the number is, how much you have in your data. It's a large amount. The really precise version of that data set that aligns to the client you're working with.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's over 1 million data points now.
That's a lot. So I'm going to take the reins for just a minute, but then we're going to get into some of the actual sort of war stories, the real world stories that come from these sorts of direct, hands-on engagements that SPI does around benchmarking that move beyond sort of like, oh, I have a subtle awareness of this thing, but the actual conversations that come out of these sort of getting the red out conversations. But why does this matter, right? Going back to Connor's point about EBITDA, at Cantata, we talk about this idea of balancing through AI optimized insight across these different things, right? It's not just about the bottom line, because, for example, if we improve our utilization by 1% or our margin by 1%, which is a great thing to do, right? I mean, you don't even really need the SPI benchmark for this. If you have 250 billable resources and a $200 hourly rate, if you improve by a utilization point, that's about $1 million in revenue annually based on that increased chargeability. But that's not the end of the story because that's not the whole point of health. This is actually something that Hester, the CFO, mentioned on day one, right? Like if that 1% utilization increase comes at the expense of client referenceability or at the expense of talent retention, then that is not fundamentally a healthy organization. So how do we maintain that balance and that tension in a way across every project and across our entire portfolio of projects in a way that is intentional rather than sometimes blindly, right? Every project has the opportunity to be these trade-offs. And a lot of times I find when businesses are going, you know what, our utilization is right where we want it to be, our projects are coming in on time and on budget, and our clients are happy. If you're doing that out of spreadsheets, if you're doing that out of sub-optimized processes, I can sort of tell you where what it's coming at the expense of, right? It's probably coming at the expense of this other part of the circle, the team. But these things correlate, right? Project overruns, this seems obvious, but the SPI data tells us statistically have an obvious impact on client referenceability, right? Fewer than 5% of projects overrunning correlates to greater than 73% referenceability of clients. More than 30% of projects overrunning decreases that referenceability by 18%. On the employee side, on average, it takes 140 days to find, recruit, hire, and onboard new consultants after an employee departs. The actual cost of replacing a valuable consultant, according to SPI, usually exceeds $150,000. And that's the cost of the hiring process, but also the cost of the downtime that comes with that outage. And so considering all these costs in tandem is really important when we consider, why do we benchmark? Why do we create that situational awareness of not just what our performance looks like, but what it looks like relative to what other businesses like us are doing? So we know where the biggest opportunities for improvement are. Before we get into the wake-up calls, I want to do a live poll and get a sense of how people think of benchmarking now, right? How would you describe your organization's current approach to benchmarking performance? We'll give a minute for people to put in their answers for this. Is it continuous optimization, benchmarking embedded in how you operate? Is it a regular practice? You're benchmarking at set intervals, annually, quarterly? Occasional check-ins. When we need to do it, we do it, mostly ad hoc, or not a priority, right? We rarely benchmark. We don't necessarily see it as essential. Still seeing some responses roll in. Why don't we go ahead and push the results live now and talk about what we're seeing, Connor? All right, so I think everyone's seeing the responses now. So it looks like 35% say it's a regular practice. They benchmark at set intervals, annually, quarterly, maybe annually in tandem with when the annual SPI benchmark comes out. And then about 26% on either side saying it's either occasional or continuous optimization. Anything about that surprise you, Connor?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think that's a good testament to Cantata's customers here using the benchmarking process and going forwards. When I'm out in the market, I'd probably expect it to be a little lower than that in general. But no, that's pretty promising, I'd say.
All right, so let's get into the setup. Connor, I know when we were talking and prepping for this session, and we were talking about which of the 5 pillars matters most, one of your premises is actually it's leadership that drives the most impact.
Yeah, I think okay, so if I was and I do get asked this question as well, Connor, I don't have any benchmarks, I'm not buying anything, I don't have any money. What should I focus on given your knowledge right now in the industry of what's happening? And for me, there's a clear winner of all of the pillars, and it's leadership. So of our 5 pillars, the one that correlates most highly with high performance is leadership without a doubt. I mean, you can see from the table here, and this is just one of the 165 metrics that we capture, right? This is talking about the well understood vision, mission, and strategy piece. And you can see everything under here correlates high. You have higher percentage of bids won, more likely to recommend company to friends and families, higher on time delivery project. All of those things go up, the stronger leadership is. So one of the things I started to think about is, okay, well, if we pause for a second, if we think about the best leaders that we've ever worked for, we then start to think about what made them stand out. So if you move on to the next slide for me here, Charles, was it their clarity? Was it their vision? Was it their inspiration, their communication, or their ability to prioritize that made them stand out as leaders? I think for me, if I think about my career and where I've been, great leaders are decisive and they act with conviction. And the problem with that is when I look at some of the leaders that perhaps haven't been so great, one of the things they've lacked is conviction, probably one of the first things I would say to go. And the reason for that is they didn't have the evidence to act on. So time and again, from our perspective, when we look at the data, if you get the right leadership, performance in your company will follow.
So now let's pivot into these real world stories where you're working directly with these clients at SPI, anonymized, real world stories from your work benchmarking services organization. What are some of these wake up calls that you're inspiring that are taking people from blind spots to breakthroughs? And what do those conversations tend to look like? So the first one I wanted to focus on, I use this analogy frequently ever since a few years ago. I heard from a services leader, they put it in a way that I've just quoted every time I've gotten a chance since, right? My job is to maintain the tightest possible team to provide the best services to customers, which that is actually a really hard job then, right? How do you maintain the tightest possible team? I think of services as everyone is trying to pull as tightly on this rubber band without giving it any slack, but also not so tightly that it snaps. And what we tend to find is when you put in a PSA like Cantata and it's almost like turning on the lights in a room. Most businesses realize there's actually a lot more slack in the rubber band than they thought there was. There's like, well, there's some capacity over here. What's that doing there? But also some businesses realize we are a minute away from this rubber band snapping, right? A sort of, like we said yesterday in the IDC session, a self-reinforcing death spiral. And so, Connor, share your perspective around an instance where you've given guidance around this.
Well, I think to your point on the rubber bands, right? There isn't just one. Like we collect 165 metrics. There's at least 165, and let's be honest, there's going to be more that we don't touch at the moment. So, if I give the example, so there was a firm that we worked with. They had 50 billable consultants and 100 operational staff. Normally, let's be honest, I would be expecting a business like that to have between 10 and 15%. These guys weren't just a little bit overweight, they were bottom percentile bad in terms of what I'd seen ever across the more than million data points that we have. Before we start to, run around and panic about the state that the organization is in, there is the first sense check, which is, okay, is this business special? Are they doing something fundamentally different to the rest of the market that would warrant this particular metric to be in this direction? Spoiler, in this case, they weren't. And so when they came to us initially, it was very much, hey, we think we've got a bit of a problem. We think we might be a little bit overweight. When we started to dive in a little bit deeper, their original discussion was we might fix this next quarter. We dive in a little bit deeper and it changes from, okay, we're going to deal with it next quarter to actually we should probably come up with a plan of action this week, next week, and get something kicked off before the end of the month. And in their case, it wasn't just let's just let go of a bunch of operational staff. Actually, some of it was, can we move some operational staff to the billable side? Because guess what? They didn't have, they had more backlog than they could deal with and all of that other jazz. There were lots of no-brainers to move them from A to B.
So the next thing I want to focus on, incremental gains, right? I mean, when I talk about the SPA benchmark, I always try not to talk about level 1 to level 5, but just level 2 to level 3, level 3 to level 4, because the gains that can be you can see here, right? A level 2 organization on average has their staff, each person 229 hours per year on admin time. Level 3, 188 hours, right? So it's a delta of 40 hours or so. But when you extrapolate that out across 250 people, it's $2 million in revenue. This is somewhat obvious, but when you really break it down, it can be beneficial. But I want you to tell the story about, a bucket of time that people spend time on that usually is considered good non-billable time. But that depends, right?
Yeah, one of those is it always depends. So doing our standard scorecard across 165 metrics, most of the usual suspects pop up. Once you're in the groove of it, you see the same things kind of over and over. But there was one metric that stood out that was a little unusual, shall we say, and that was mandatory training days. So they were running at twice the market average. At first glance, not a crisis, but you start to dig in, and it turns out to be a hangover from a past issue where actually their consultants weren't trained enough and they just forgot to update the policy once they started to get the benefits of putting in place the new policy. So we adjusted that, we freed up experienced consultants from unnecessary training. Guess what? More time for client delivery. Simple fix, immediately boosted productivity. And I think this is one of the powers of benchmarking, right? We can look at what are high performing organizations doing and what are you doing at the moment? And we can use those high performing organizations as a North Star if they're relevant enough for what it is that we should be aiming for. So this is about using the data to help spot hidden drains on performance that you would never normally otherwise see.
And once again, your question to them as you're sense checking is like, well, is training your consultants twice as much, making them twice as good? And when the answer is no, then the obvious fix is then you're putting too much effort into this thing that you can actually pull back on, which actually ties into the last story we want to share, which actually in the last session, the poll we ran around what objectives are our customers trying to focus on right now, the number one thing that came in was increasing projects delivered on time. So that's a nice hook for this. But the thing to keep in mind is that idea of what on time looks like in the market is shifting. And so, you just want to make sure that you're also not uh becoming so good at something that it comes at the expense of everything else, to the point of balance that we talked about earlier. So Connor, why don't you talk a little bit about the perspective on time?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So most execs have a gut instinct. Our margins are too low, we're discounting too much, projects are overrunning. They're often right, but sometimes the problem is bigger than they expect, or it's not necessarily where they should be focusing. So problem being bigger than they expect, reference my story earlier about the overweight client. So it's a client that we were looking at, and they were saying we're not delivering, or our on-time delivery is slipping. We need to work on it. So we used the benchmark, and we actually managed to validate that it wasn't just them that was slipping. The entire market, year on year, has been getting worse project on-time delivery scores for a few years now. So it's not that they were just getting worse, it's that everyone, to use my golf analogy earlier, everyone in the tournament was getting worse at golf, not just them. And then the question then becomes, is it worth them putting in the extra effort to fight what's happening, right? We've got this GIF in the corner of Usain Bolt doing his 100-meter sprint. If he's going to shave off another second of that 100-meter time, that's an unimaginable amount of effort, right? If you're level 5 in something like project on time delivery, are you really getting the rewards for the amount of effort you're going to put in order to improve that one metric, or are you just over indexing on a particular area?
Which ties back into prioritization, right? Like there's 1,000 things your organization can be working on, but in trying to be 100% better than the field on this thing as the whole field is getting worse, are you basically guaranteeing you're going to tear an Achilles, right? Maybe slow
Yeah.
down. You still get the benefit of being top of the pack.
Yeah, you're still first without tearing your Achilles.
So let's talk about how AI fits into this.
So we've just completed our AI study for 2025, and I think you must have been living under a rock if you haven't heard this already. The game is changing, things are shifting, we know. So for 20 years, we've had benchmarking more as a rear view kind of mirror thing where people come and reference us and use it. AI is starting to change that. So this table here is showing which area do you think AI is going to have the biggest improvement in 2024 and in 2025. And you can see one of the biggest changes is in corporate reporting. And that is super important because, as I mentioned earlier, leadership is one of the biggest drivers for high performance, right? So we're seeing a big change in corporate reporting. That reporting is giving people information, it's allowing them to act quicker and be more decisive. And we're seeing a big change there because they're moving from decisions in weeks to decisions in seconds. So leaders are starting to ask questions and get contextual answers instantly, whereas before it would have taken them ages. So this good to great reference, oh, you moved on a bit quick. This good to great reference in the corner means it's going to be easier to be a good leader as per the definition of today, but the changes, the bar for great will rise.
Which ties into the big thing that we want to talk about today and unveil, which is we want people to imagine a scenario where you're not looking at a report in order to get your benchmarking data, but it actually finds you, right? Benchmarking insights surfaced in context, granular, peer-aligned data, the kind of data that we were talking about with Connor that you get from the scorecard engagement, but without having to necessarily go out of the way to do the scorecard engagement to get that initial wake-up call. Up-to-date visibility into what average performance looks like for your cohort and high performance looks like for your cohort. And most of all, AI agents, moving them from time savers to force multipliers because they're trained on rich independent benchmarking data and therefore can surface recommendations shaped on trends and best practices in the industry, where we've been talking throughout this about the expertise engine being this thing that understands your business, but then doesn't understand your business in a vacuum, but understands it in context of the industry around it and what high performance looks like. If that were able to be true, then every PSA interaction would have the chance to be this kind of transformative wake-up call. So, Connor, I'm going to pass it to you first because I want you to talk about a little bit about what the general vision for SPI Insight is. Why this? Why now?
Perfect. So this is today's big reveal. So for the first time, we are embedding years of aggregated, anonymized delivery metrics directly into the PSA platform that you already use. So we're calling it SPI Inside. And with SPI Inside, your system isn't just going to report utilization, margin, or delivery. It's going to tell you what those numbers mean in the context of the market that you're operating in. So if we dive in a little deeper, you'll see here on the next slide, there's an example of a conversation with an agent. I don't expect you to read all that text, but essentially, if I give you a brief overview, you'll be able to ask, our utilization is 77%. Is that strong enough? Our project margin is slipping. Where should I go and focus? And you're going to get an answer that's not, it depends, or let's take that offline. We've heard that too many times from consultants, I'm sure. But for the first time, we're going to have benchmarking moving from a rear view mirror to the steering wheel, helping you guide your business forwards because it's there in context of the decisions that you're making, moving you forwards.
And this is going to be something that we think this will be part of the secret sauce of what makes the expertise engine extra powerful. That domain specific context that moves beyond what a generic LLM can do. And with the agreement that we have just entered into, this kind of exclusive partnership, SPI Insight is going to be something that's very powerful. And it's going to be something that I think SPI is going to take to more categories in the market. But Cantata is going to be the only PSA provider that is going to be able to surface this independent data set within our PSA and train our AI on it. And that is going to be, we think, really powerful for our customers because it's going to supercharge what the expertise engine can do, what the accelerators can do, and therefore what you can do with Cantata. And I want to say it doesn't end there, right? Wake up calls shouldn't end at embedded signals. We want you, when you see a wake up call in the system, to be able to follow up on it. When benchmarking surfaces a gap, we want our customers to be able to go deeper with SPI, get that hands on conversation, get an independent, unbiased, comprehensive PS maturity assessment across these pillars and levels. So we're also, as part of this partnership, going to offer an exclusive discounted rate on the SPI scorecards that's available to Cantata customers to equip businesses to drive that prioritization, that decisiveness, that conviction. So I'm going to do one more poll here and ask, would you like to take advantage of an independent SPI maturity assessment and exclusive Cantata customer discount? And while that poll is coming up and people are answering it, Connor, we have like a minute left, tell people kind of what they can expect from that kind of engagement.
Yeah, I think most people, when they come to us to come and do a scorecard, their expectation is they want to kind of confirm a gut feeling or take their business in a specific direction. What they usually leave with is something that is driving revenue growth and a plan that they're going to go and tackle A, B, C, X, Y, Z when they start to look at what the results are of their scorecard. And so it really gives them a bit of direction to be like, okay, what I already had planned was right, and I'm going in that direction anyway. So it gives them that conviction. Or it's okay, actually, these are the things I should be focusing on. Let's go grow some revenue.
Which all ties back to revenue growth. That's right. So really quickly, kind of last thing I want to say is the SPI 2026 benchmark survey is now open. Use this QR code on the screen to go take that survey. And especially if you're considering doing one of these maturity assessments, this is a great first step because you're already gathering and processing the data that SPI is then going to use to do the maturity assessment. So we always encourage Cantata customers to get out there and do this. If you do it, even if you don't go into doing a maturity assessment, you're going to get the full report. You're going to get an executive insights report that looks at the pillars at a high level. But we really encourage everyone to go ahead and participate in SPI's 2026 benchmark survey. And my last reminder is sign up for the Cantata community, sign up for Cantata Stars, become a part of this thriving community that we're building and growing here at Converge. we're not going to have any time for questions, so those that have come in, we'll be sure to follow up with those, and be sure you don't miss the next session that's coming up. Brent Trimble, Cantata's Brent Trimble, is going to be talking with Kennedy Intelligence about their research into how to scale a professional services firm in the AI era, their insights. I love talking with them, and it's going to be a great session. So be sure you head on over to that one. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Connor, for joining us today and sharing this exciting news.
No, thank you for having me, Charles.